Hey guys, John here with another installment of DF Retro. This time we're taking a look at console conversions of Duke Nukem 3D. It's been 20 years since its release, but Duke was a big name back in 1996. It only makes sense then that publishers would want to capitalize on that by releasing the game on still very new consoles. Unlike these days, however, the game was never ported internally by 3D Realms itself. Rather, each platform received a custom version of the game designed by separate development studios. It's fascinating to see how the ports turned out, with each developer taking its own unique approach to the projects. Let's start with the Nintendo 64 version of the game. Duke Nukem 64 was ported to the N64 by Eurocom, and it would prove to be an interesting and challenging project on multiple fronts. Most obviously, the team would need to self-censor much of its content. Nintendo of the 90s wasn't too keen on the more violent and sexual aspects of the game, and despite 3D Realms' objections, the porting team pushed to clean things up. But of course, we're more interested in the conversion process here. You see, the original PC version was based on Ken Silverman's build engine, an engine which used raycasting to fake 3D visuals. The N64, however, was designed to crunch triangles, and this sort of approach was very inefficient for the hardware and would have run very slowly. As a result, a new renderer was crafted specifically for this version of the game, while a utility was created in order to convert build engine map data into the new format. What's interesting here is that this utility could convert sector data in real time, but due to speed considerations, much of the base maps needed to be pre-calculated, which had an impact on certain portions of the level design. One advantage of the new engine lies in its support for a true 3D perspective. It was possible to look up and down in a way that didn't completely warp the viewpoint, as was the case in the original PC version. In addition, the engine could now support polygon enemies. Of course, this mostly did not happen due to lack of time and resources, but at least the final boss was rendered in full 3D. Explosions, however, were entirely 3D on N64 with a very different look compared to the original game. Beyond this, all weapons were recreated as 3D renders and converted to 3D sprites for the game. While I'm partial to the original designs, it is fascinating seeing new takes on classic weapons. This also allowed the dev team to implement 4 new weapons as well. Texture work is solid throughout, though obviously detail takes a hit. Being an N64 title, the expected texture filtering is in place here, but we also see a completely new take on sky rendering with a nice blue hue used instead of the two-dimensional city background of the original. It does give the whole thing a different vibe. All of this was rendered at a surprisingly high frame rate. Duke 64 targets 30 frames per second, and by and large, the game comes close to hitting it. But it never feels quite as fluid as it should. The reason? Duke Nukem 64 suffers from improper frame pacing. We moused through each frame one by one to be sure, and sure enough, we encountered plenty of random 16 millisecond frames throughout. Strange. There are certainly plenty of normal dips under 30 FPS as well. Overall, it feels smooth enough and smoother than many competing shooters on the platform, but not quite as fluid as we would like. Still, even reaching this level of performance did come at the expense of certain effects. The team originally wanted to include dynamic lighting for weapon effects to the point where they had it up and running. Unfortunately, the performance just wasn't where it needed to be, so the feature was cut. The game also includes split-screen multiplayer, which was a feature not available in the other ports of the game. It was pretty expected on Nintendo 64, however. Another major loss is the soundtrack. The dev team ran into issues that ultimately required them to decide between in-game music or Duke's voice effects. Personally, I would have preferred the music, but it's clear that you really can't do Duke Nukem without his quips. Without a dedicated sound chip, and with limited cartridge space, we can understand how this would come to pass. Still, this is a very competently made port that takes advantage of Nintendo 64 in just the right way in order to deliver a clean, smooth-playing iteration of Duke Nukem 3D. Of all the ports, this version features the smoothest frame rate, the cleanest visuals, and the best controls. But while Duke 64 may be at top of the heap, the Miracle port can be found on Sega Saturn. Created by Lobotomy Software, the same team responsible for the incredible Quake port that I looked at last month, Duke Nukem 3D on Sega Saturn is an incredibly ambitious conversion of the game that manages to look and play very faithfully to the original. The Saturn version runs on the same slave driver engine that powered Quake and Power Slave, meaning that we have full 3D environments here, like the N64 game, with a unique look and feel. The remarkable Ezra Driesbach continued to improve the engine between releases, and Duke was capable of supporting larger levels with improved lighting across the board. This also meant recreating the levels in 3D. The two-dimensional nature of the original PC game meant that a lot of environments could be fake to a certain extent, but in the Saturn version, rather than cutting back on these areas, things were simply pieced together like an elaborate puzzle. The original level design remains relatively faithful, but it all fits together in a more logical fashion now. All of this was created using Lobotomy's in-house editor, Brew. Unlike the Nintendo 64 port, as much of the original art as possible was retained here. Some of the color data was eliminated, while much of it was broken up into smaller chunks, but the game ultimately feels very faithful to the original game. Texture warping is present, of course, but as with Quake, it is minimized by smart design and rarely becomes a serious problem here. Despite the move to a 3D environment, enemies, weapons, and explosions are all still two-dimensional, just like the original game. Unlike the original game, however, dynamic lighting is now present in the Saturn version and looks excellent. The game has a different sense of scale than the other versions due to the recreation of its maps, and it ends up feeling unlike any other major port of the game. The game also has a very different feel from other versions of Duke. Character movement has real momentum and weight, and the game speed has been slightly modified. This fact alone makes the Sega Saturn version the most fascinating version to actually play. Oh, and perhaps the most important inclusion is Death Tank. Yes, this excellent game is a great bonus and a blast with friends. And you won't find it in any other version of the game, of course. Performance-wise, things are far sight worse here than with Duke Nukem 64. Once again, the game targets 30 frames per second, but it regularly dips below this. It never becomes difficult to play, but it certainly doesn't feel as smooth as we'd like either. Considering the hardware, however, it's a miracle it runs this well, especially in the face of the poor performance we saw in many other shooters on the platform. Overall though, Duke on Saturn is a great port and perhaps my favorite of the bunch. But Duke 3D also made an appearance on Sony's PlayStation, and unfortunately things didn't quite turn out as favorably. The PlayStation version is perhaps the one which I know the least about. It was developed by a company known as Aardvark, but there simply isn't a lot of information out there on it. What I can say is that it runs and plays worse than the other two versions. That's not to say it's inherently bad, however. Unlike the previous two ports, it appears that the PlayStation version is actually using the original build engine here. It looks very similar to the PC version running in low resolution, and quite unlike other PlayStation games of the era. The reason is simple. If the game is running build, then it's likely being executed entirely in software. There's no evidence of affine texture mapping here, and it's clear that the game is still very much two-dimensional. Something that becomes obvious when you start looking up and down. The texture work, enemies, animation, and effects are all very close to the PC original. Heck, you could even make use of quick saves during the levels, a feature absent in other versions of the game. Beyond that, an enhanced soundtrack is present and features a selection of interesting remixes of well-known tracks. So it looks and sounds nice, but what's the issue? Well, if you couldn't tell already, it's performance. The game simply doesn't run well at all. Right out of the gate, the frame rate is well under 30 FPS, and it just feels incredibly jerky to play. The frame rate is completely unlocked and can jump between 60 frames per second all the way down to 10, just by moving the camera around. It just doesn't feel responsive to play at all as a result. This is likely the result of presumably using a software renderer here. On one hand, it eliminates many of the visual flaws you typically find in PlayStation games, but at the same time, you do lose a lot of speed. We saw a similar situation with Doom on Sega Saturn, where John Carmack requested that the developer use a software renderer in order to produce a more accurate-looking game at the expense of speed. All of this is compounded by the controls. The whole thing feels too fast for its own good, making it very difficult to accurately move and aim. The game does have generous auto-aim, of course, but it generally just feels uncomfortable to control. In the end, it's a neat version of the game, and a pretty accurate port of the PC version, but the poor frame rate and lousy controls make it very difficult to enjoy today. But wait, we're not done yet. First and foremost, we have Duke Nukem 3D on the Sega Genesis, or Megadrive depending on your region. Yes, Duke appeared on Sega's 16-bit console in a very strange take on the franchise. It's not much of a looker, but that doesn't mean it isn't impressive in its own right. This is obviously not a port of Duke 3D, rather an original game modeled after Wolfenstein 3D. The fact that this runs at all on a stock Genesis is actually pretty impressive, I'd argue, and the game itself isn't half bad. The frame rate is rather low, of course, but it is fascinating to see this game exist. It was originally released only in Brazil by Tectoy, but the rights were eventually purchased years later and it has since been released elsewhere. An interesting story indeed. But there was actually one more version that was significantly worse. Yes, it's Duke Nukem 3D on the Game.com. Okay, so in this case I actually had to resort to emulation. Now I actually do own one of these Game.com units, and let me tell you, it is one terrible system. The screen is simply the worst thing I've ever seen in a portable game machine, and its games are only one step above Tiger's older products. It's really that bad. And so is this game. Duke 3D on Game.com consists of flipping between a series of flat images while shooting enemies. There's really nothing 3D about it. It's just a slow, choppy shooting gallery. This is, without a doubt, the worst product with Duke's name on it. I mean, it's fascinating in some ways, but the end result simply isn't fun to play, at all. Now, there were more ports of Duke 3D throughout the ages, but these are some of the ones that I found the most interesting. Hopefully you've enjoyed revisiting them with me. But that's all the time we have for now. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to like and subscribe, and until next time, stay retro.